Imagine standing on a battlefield. Not a clean, glorious battlefield from a movie, a real one. The ground beneath your feet is soft, red. The air smells like smoke and iron. In every direction you can see, stretching further than your eyes can reach, thousands upon thousands of people who will never stand up again. To your left, a river runs past, but today it doesn't look like water. Today the Daya River runs red. To your right, the city of Tosali, the capital of the kingdom of Kalinga, is still smoldering. Its people, those who survived, have been marched away in long, silent columns. Fathers separated from children, farmers separated from their land. 100,000 people. That is the number recorded in an ancient inscription, a massive stone carving, as the death toll of this battle. 100,000 people, gone in weeks. Another 150,000 were forced from their homes. And the man responsible for all of this is standing right there on that cliff. He is trembling, not with pride, not with the thrill of victory, but with something he has never felt before, something deep and terrible cracking open inside his chest. 100,000 dead, and I did this. This is not a quote from the battle. This is not something a historian wrote about him. These words, something like these words, came from the king himself, carved into rock, a confession to all of humanity, forever. The king standing on that cliff, his name, in the language of his own inscriptions, was Devanampiya Piyadasi, which means, beloved of the gods, he who looks upon others with kindness. But you probably know him by another name, Ashoka the Great, the emperor who changed the world, not with swords, but with kindness. This is his story. All of it. Chapter 1, the world Ashoka was born into. Before we can understand Ashoka, before we can understand why his story matters, we need to understand the world he was born into. Let's zoom out, way out. The year is somewhere around 304 BCE. Though historians debate the exact date, most estimates place Ashoka's birth somewhere between 304 and 296 BCE. It doesn't matter if we're off by a few years. What matters is this. The world was enormous, it was ancient, and it was violent. India, the land we're talking about, wasn't one country back then. It was a vast mosaic, dozens of kingdoms, hundreds of tribes, languages you'd barely recognize today, jungles that stretched for weeks, rivers so wide you couldn't see the other side. And in the middle of all this, a dynasty, a ruling family that had done something no one had ever done before. They had united almost all of it. This dynasty was called the Mauryas, and the man who started it, Ashoka's grandfather, was one of the most remarkable figures in all of human history. His name was Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta came from almost nothing. His exact origins are debated by historians. Some accounts describe him as low-born, perhaps an orphan, perhaps raised in poverty. What everyone agrees on is this. Around 321 BCE, this young man looked at the fractured kingdoms of northern India, at the mess left behind when Alexander the Great's armies retreated from the northwest, and he thought, I can do better. With the help of a brilliant, ruthless political advisor named Chanakya, sometimes called the Indian Machiavelli, Chandragupta built an army. Then he built an empire, one conquest at a time. By the time Chandragupta was done, the Mauryan Empire controlled more of the Indian subcontinent than any ruler before him, stretching from what is today Afghanistan in the northwest, all the way to Bengal in the east, and down towards central India. An empire, by the way, is a huge collection of kingdoms and territories all governed by one powerful ruler. Imagine if every country in Europe, from Spain to Poland, was suddenly ruled by a single king. That gives you some idea of the scale. After Chandragupta came his son Bindusara. Bindusara continued expanding the empire southward. He was a capable ruler, serious, ambitious, but not as celebrated as his father. And then came Bindusara's son, the one we're here to talk about. Pataliputra, the capital of the Mauryan Empire, was, in its time, one of the largest and most extraordinary cities on earth. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who visited the city and wrote about it, described walls stretching for miles, 64 gates, hundreds of towers, and a royal palace he compared to the greatest Persian buildings he had ever seen. To put that in perspective, Pataliputra at its height may have housed anywhere from 150,000 to 400,000 people. In a world where most cities had tens of thousands at most, this was extraordinary, Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a modern capital city, like Delhi, or London, or New York, rising out of the jungle. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes wrote an entire book called Indica about his time in Pataliputra. Though most of the original is lost, quotes from it survive in other ancient writings, and they describe a city so magnificent that Greek readers reportedly found it hard to believe. He described roads lined with trees, shaded benches for travelers, and even royal gardens with tame peacocks and exotic birds. Zoom out moment. While Chandragupta was building his empire in India, here's what was happening in the rest of the world. Alexander the Great had just died in Babylon in 323 BCE, leaving his own empire to fracture. In China, the Warring States period was in full swing, a time of constant battle between rival kingdoms that would eventually produce the first Qin emperor. In Italy, a city called Rome was fighting to survive against its neighbors. The world, everywhere, was turbulent. Into this world, this age of empires, ambition, and violence, a boy was born in the royal court of Pataliputra. But growing up as a prince in the Mauryan court was not the golden fairy tale you might imagine. Ashoka was surrounded by luxury and by danger, because the greatest threat to a Mauryan prince wasn't enemies outside the palace walls. It was the brothers inside them. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Would Be King. Ashoka was born into abundance. Silk clothing, servants, gardens, elephants in the royal stables, more food at one meal than most Indian families saw in a month. But Ashoka was also born into something else. Pressure. His father, Emperor Bindusara, had many wives and many sons. Ancient sources, including the Buddhist chronicle called the Ashokavadana, which means the Legends of Ashoka, suggest Bindusara may have had anywhere from 16 to over 100 sons. Now, historians caution us that these numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. This was a common literary device in ancient texts meant to show the greatness of a king. But the point remains, Ashoka was one of many princes competing for one throne. In the Mauryan court, being a prince wasn't a guarantee of power. It was the starting line of a race. What kind of education did a Mauryan prince receive? It was comprehensive and demanding. Young Ashoka would have studied the Vedas, ancient sacred texts full of hymns, philosophical ideas, and knowledge about the universe, as well as political science, mathematics, history, and Sanskrit. He would have trained in archery, horsemanship, and combat. He would have learned the art of statecraft, how to govern, how to negotiate, how to use people's loyalty and fear. The great political manual of the time was called the Arthashastra, written by the legendary Chanakya himself. It was essentially a handbook for how to run an empire. Some of its advice was brilliant, some of it was cold-blooded. It included advice like always test your advisor's loyalty, never trust completely, keep your enemies close, and be ruthless when necessary. This was the world young Ashoka was trained in. Not kindness, not peace, power. The Arthashastra, the ancient Indian political science text that Ashoka would have studied, was lost for over 1,000 years. It was rediscovered in 1905 by a scholar named R. Shamasastri in a library in Mysore, India. When it was translated, historians were stunned. It turned out to be one of the most sophisticated political texts of the ancient world, rivaling Machiavelli's The Prince in its calculated approach to governance. It had been sitting forgotten in a manuscript collection for centuries. What was Ashoka actually like as a boy? Here's where we have to be honest with you. We don't have diaries. We don't have childhood letters. The historical record about Ashoka's youth is thin, and what survives comes mostly from Buddhist texts written centuries after his death, which were more interested in making him a religious hero than in recording his precise biography. But here is what we can reasonably piece together. He was clearly intelligent enough to be entrusted later with the governorship of 2 major cities, which doesn't happen by accident. He seems to have been strong-willed. There are suggestions in various sources that his father didn't particularly favor him, perhaps even disliked him. Some accounts suggest Ashoka's mother was not the queen, but a secondary wife, which would have affected his status at court. And he clearly learned early what it meant to be overlooked. Because when Chandragupta built an empire and Bindusara expanded it, both men named other sons as their chosen heirs. Not Ashoka. Not yet. While young Ashoka was studying scrolls and practicing with swords in Pataliputra, the Chinese philosopher Mencius, who, like Confucius before him, believed that good rulers govern with virtue, not just violence, had recently died. Thousands of miles apart, thinkers in both India and China were wrestling with the same question: what makes a good king? Ashoka would spend his entire adult life trying to answer it. But before he could become a great king, or even a good one, Ashoka would be tested, sent far from the comfort of the palace, into chaos, into danger, into places where a young prince either proved himself or disappeared. Chapter 3: The Prince in the Shadows. At some point in his youth, likely when he was a teenager or young man, Ashoka was sent away from Pataliputra. Not as a punishment exactly, but not as a reward either. He was sent as a governor, a representative of the emperor, a young prince who needed to prove his worth far from the cushions of the royal court. His first major posting, Taxila. Taxila was one of the great cities of the ancient world, a bustling, complicated place where the cultures of India, Persia, Central Asia, and Greece all collided and mixed. It was famous for its university, which attracted scholars and students from across Asia. It sat on the ancient trade route we now call the Silk Road, the network of paths that connected China to the Mediterranean. It was also when Ashoka arrived in revolt. The exact details are murky. Historical sources disagree on what exactly was happening. But it seems the people of Taxila were unhappy with their local Mauryan administrators. They weren't rebelling against the empire itself, according to some accounts. They were rebelling against corrupt or cruel local officials. Ashoka, the young prince, had to handle it. And here's what's interesting. According to the Buddhist chronicles, he did handle it. He brought calm to Taxila, not primarily through military force, but through administration and communication. He listened to the people's grievances. Was the teenage prince already showing signs of the leader he would become? Perhaps. His second major posting was Ujjain, the capital of the province of Avanti, in central India. Ujjain was a rich, important city, a center of trade, religion, and astronomy. Managing it was a significant responsibility. It was also, in ancient Indian tradition, considered a sacred city, one of the great holy sites of Hinduism, built along the banks of the Kshipra River. It was here, according to some accounts, particularly from later Buddhist sources, that Ashoka fell in love. Her name was Devi. She was the daughter of a merchant from Vidisha, a nearby town. Beautiful, intelligent, devoted. The two reportedly met when Ashoka stopped at her father's house during a journey. Now historians caution that much of this romantic story comes from Buddhist texts written long after the events, and may be more legend than hard fact. But there is strong corroborating evidence. An ancient Buddhist stupa, a dome-shaped religious monument, at Sanchi, near Vidisha, has been identified by scholars as likely connected to Devi, and inscriptions at Sanchi suggest she had real historical significance in the Buddhist tradition. So while we can't verify every detail of their love story, a connection between Ashoka and a woman of Vidisha seems genuinely plausible. The great stupa at Sanchi, just 50 kilometers from Vidisha, is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Originally commissioned by Ashoka himself, it is one of the oldest stone structures in India. Its elaborate carved stone gateways, called toranas, are among the finest examples of ancient Indian art anywhere in the world. Some of the stories carved into those gates show scenes from the life of the Buddha, and may have been supervised or inspired by Devi herself, who became a devoted Buddhist. Ashoka and Devi had children, a son named Mahinda and a daughter named Sangamitra. We'll meet them again later in this story, because they will change the world in their own remarkable ways. But for now, Ashoka was a prince with a family, managing a province far from the throne, capable, ambitious, but still in the shadow of his father, his brothers, and the enormous empire around him. While Ashoka was governing Ujjain, the famous Library of Alexandria in Egypt was being assembled, a project that tried to collect every book in the known world. Thousands of miles apart, great civilizations were investing in knowledge, in administration, in city building. It was a remarkable age of human ambition. And Ashoka was about to be pulled from the edges of the empire into its violent, bloody center. Because back in Pataliputra, the Emperor Bindusara was dying. And when a Mauryan emperor died, when that throne opened up, the princes of the court did not wait calmly for someone to hand them a crown. They fought for it. Chapter 4: The Road to the Throne. Here we enter the most dangerous and historically murky part of Ashoka's story, the succession to the Mauryan throne. Let's be completely upfront with you. We do not know exactly what happened. The ancient sources that describe this period, particularly the Buddhist chronicles like the Ashoka, were written hundreds of years after the events, had strong religious motivations for their storytelling, and often contradict each other. What we can say with confidence is this: Ashoka became emperor of the Mauryan Empire around 268 BCE. Historians place this date between 270 and 268 BCE, with 268 BCE being the most widely cited. The exact sequence of events that got him there is disputed. But let's walk through what the ancient accounts describe, while being clear about what's verified and what's legend. According to the Ashoka and related texts, when Emperor Bindusara fell gravely ill, a fierce competition for succession broke out among the princes. The throne was traditionally expected to go to a prince named Susima, apparently Bindusara's favored eldest son. But Ashoka, the story goes, had powerful allies, particularly among Pataliputra's ministers and administrators who had seen his competence and preferred him. According to the chronicles, Ashoka raced back to Pataliputra. Bindusara died, and what followed was a brutal power struggle. The Buddhist texts make dramatic claims here, claims that have troubled historians for generations. The Ashokavadana says that Ashoka killed 99 of his brothers, sparing only one named Tishyaraksha. Modern historians, including the distinguished scholar Romila Thapar, who wrote the definitive academic biography of Ashoka, treat this claim with significant skepticism. It has the feel of a literary exaggeration, a way of emphasizing how ruthless the pre-transformation Ashoka was, making his later change of heart seem more dramatic. What is likely true is that there was a violent succession conflict, that Ashoka was not the obvious or intended heir, and that he outmaneuvered and possibly eliminated significant rivals to claim the throne. Even the date of his coronation is debated. Some accounts suggest he seized power after Bindusara's death, but didn't hold his formal coronation for several years, possibly around 268 BCE, perhaps while consolidating his hold on the empire. In other words, the road to the throne was dangerous, bloody, and not clean. Even before the Kalinga War, Ashoka was not a gentle figure. The brilliant scholar who first translated and decoded Ashoka's rock edicts, the inscriptions that give us direct insight into his own thoughts, was a British archaeologist named James Prinsep. In 1837, Prinsep cracked the ancient script called Brahmi, which had been forgotten for nearly 1,000 years. Before Prinsep's discovery, no one knew who had written these mysterious inscriptions on rocks and pillars across India. When he decoded them, he realized they were from an emperor who kept calling himself Piyadasi, beloved of the gods. It took more detective work to confirm that Piyadasi was Ashoka. Prinsep reportedly wept when he finally made the connection. So by approximately 268 BCE, Ashoka was emperor. Not because his father chose him, not because destiny handed him a throne on a silver platter, because he fought for it, schemed for it, possibly killed for it. When Ashoka became emperor, Rome was just beginning its first great war with Carthage, a conflict that would reshape the Mediterranean world. Euclid, the father of geometry, had recently written his foundational work. The world's great minds were busy, fighting, thinking, building. And in Pataliputra, a new emperor sat down on the Mauryan throne. He was young, he was powerful, he was feared. And he was about to show the world exactly how powerful and feared he could be. His first great project as emperor would be the most violent thing he ever did. A war so terrible that it would shatter him from the inside and send ripples that we still feel today, more than 2,200 years later. Chapter 5, Emperor of the World. Let's pause for a moment and just look at what Ashoka now controlled. The Mauryan Empire, at its height under Ashoka, is estimated to have covered approximately 5 million square kilometers, an area larger than modern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Afghanistan combined. It stretched from the Hindu Kush Mountains in the west, where Afghanistan borders modern Pakistan, all the way to the Bay of Bengal in the east. Roughly 50 to 60 million people lived within the empire's borders, a significant fraction of the entire world's population at that time. Historians estimate the global population around 260 BCE was somewhere between 150 and 200 million people. Think about what it means to govern that. The Mauryan administrative system, partly built on the framework left by Chandragupta and the Arthashastra, was remarkable in its sophistication. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a royal representative. Below them were district administrators, and below those, village-level officials. There were royal spies, called Mahamatas, who traveled the empire, gathering information and reporting back to the emperor. There was a standing army of terrifying size. Ancient sources, including Megasthenes, describe an army of 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 war elephants, numbers which are almost certainly exaggerated, but which point to a genuinely enormous military force. Pataliputra itself, the capital where Ashoka now held court, was a city of extraordinary grandeur. The imperial palace was built largely of polished stone and intricately carved wood. Later accounts, based on archaeological discoveries, describe it as surpassing even the great palaces of Persia. Ashoka, as a new emperor, was expected to rule as his grandfather and father had ruled, with strength, with expansion, with control maintained by force when necessary. And in the early years of his reign, somewhere between 268 and 261 BCE, that's exactly what he did. There are almost no detailed records of Ashoka's first years as emperor, but we know from his own later inscriptions that he performed ceremonies and rituals associated with traditional Hindu kingship. He maintained the royal hunts, elaborate, enormous events where kings rode out with hundreds of attendants to kill game, which were partly sport and partly a display of royal power. He feasted, he administered, he received tributes from conquered territories, and he looked at a map. On his eastern coast there was a kingdom that did not belong to the Mauryan Empire, a prosperous, proud, independent kingdom. Kalinga was wealthy, famous for its trade by sea, its skilled artisans, its elephants, its strategic position on the coastal trade routes. It had resisted Mauryan conquest under Chandragupta and Bindusara. It sat like a missing piece in Ashoka's otherwise almost complete picture of Indian domination. Ashoka wanted it. Why exactly? The reasons were likely a combination of factors historians typically cite: strategic necessity, controlling the eastern coast would secure trade routes and prevent a future threat; economic desire, Kalinga's wealth was significant; and simple imperial ambition, the same impulse that drives empires throughout history. In the same decade that Ashoka was eyeing Kalinga, the Qin state in China was completing its brutal conquest of rival kingdoms, a conquest that would produce the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang, in 221 BCE. Great empires were expanding everywhere. Everywhere, it seemed, violence was the tool of choice. Ashoka prepared his armies and marched. You already know how this ends, but you don't yet know what it cost. Chapter 6, The War That Changed Everything. The year was approximately 261 BCE. The Mauryan army that marched into Kalinga was one of the most powerful military forces on earth. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, war elephants, archers, cavalry, siege equipment. Kalinga's armies, though brave and determined, were significantly outmatched. The people of Kalinga knew what was coming. They fought back, hard. Ancient sources don't give us a detailed battle-by-battle account of the Kalinga War. What they give us is the result. And the result was described in words that still carry weight today, because they were written by the man who caused it. This is what Ashoka wrote in the 13th Major Rock Edict, one of his stone inscriptions carved after the war. We'll quote it in simplified translation, but these are his own words, from the original ancient Prakrit, when the king, beloved of the gods and of gracious mien, had been consecrated 8 years. The country of the Kalingas was conquered by him. 150,000 persons were thence carried away captive, 100,000 were there slain, and many times that number perished. Let that land in you for a moment. 100,000 dead, 150,000 taken from their homes, and the phrase, many times that number perished, suggests the total deaths from the war, including those who died from disease, starvation, or displacement in the aftermath, were far higher still. Some historians note that the exact numbers in the edict should be understood as symbolic or approximate. Ancient records rarely had the precision of modern statistics. But even if we have them, the scale of human suffering was catastrophic. Kalinga was conquered. The Mauryan Empire now reached the eastern coast of India, had won, and then something happened, something that no emperor before him had ever done publicly, something that would echo through 2,200 years of history. He looked at what he had done. The Ashoka tells a story that after the Kalinga War, as Ashoka walked through the destroyed land, a Buddhist monk appeared to him, calm in the chaos, peaceful in the carnage. The contrast between that man's serenity and the horror around him struck Ashoka deeply. Now this may be legend. Historians cannot verify that this specific encounter happened as described, but something broke open in Ashoka after Kalinga, and we know this not from legend, but from Ashoka's own words, carved in stone. On conquering Kalinga, the beloved of the gods felt remorse, for when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous to the beloved of the gods, and weighs heavily on his mind. An emperor, admitting publicly that he felt grief, that the conquest, his conquest, weighs heavily on him. In the ancient world, this was extraordinary. Kings didn't write that. Kings wrote about their victories, their glory, their divine right. They built monuments to their own power. Ashoka built monuments to his regret. No other emperor of Ashoka's age, no Roman general, no Chinese king, no Persian ruler, left behind a public record of grief over their own violence. That Ashoka did so is either the most remarkable act of royal humility in the ancient world, or a sophisticated political calculation, or both. Historians still debate the sincerity of his transformation, but debate its sincerity, not its occurrence. Something genuinely changed. Ashoka's Rock Edict 13, the one describing his grief over Kalinga, is one of the longest of his inscriptions, and survives in multiple locations across India, including at Shabasgari in Pakistan and Girnar in Gujarat, India. For over 1,500 years after Ashoka's death, no one knew who had written these rocks. They sat in fields, on hillsides, beside roads, this ancient emperor speaking to travelers who had no idea who he was. It was only after James Prinsep decoded Brahmi in 1837 that the world learned Ashoka's voice had been echoing, unheard, for millennia. On that blood-soaked shore of the Daya River, something died in Ashoka. Or maybe something was finally born, because the man who walked away from Kalinga was not the man who had marched into it. And what that new man would do, with one of the most powerful empires on earth, with millions of subjects, with decades of life still ahead of him, would astonish the world. It still does. Chapter 7, The King Who Wept. Empires expected their kings to come home from conquest in glory. Feasts, celebrations, songs composed in their honor, poets hired to describe the enemy's defeat in the most dramatic terms possible. Ashoka came home from Kalinga in silence. In the years immediately following Kalinga, sometime around 261 to 258 BCE, a profound transformation took place in Ashoka's life. Again, the exact timeline and the specific events are historically uncertain. But we can trace the transformation through two sources, the Buddhist chronicles and Ashoka's own edicts. The edicts tell us directly that after Kalinga, Ashoka came closer to the Dharma. This ancient Sanskrit word, dharma, is one of the most important concepts in Indian thought. It means roughly the right way of living, moral order, righteousness, duty. It is related to, but not identical with the Buddhist concept of Dhamma, which we'll explain more in the next chapter. What specifically drew Ashoka to Buddhism? According to the Ashoka and related Buddhist texts, Ashoka had an encounter that changed him. The sources describe a monk named Nigrodha, or in some versions, a different monk, whose calm, peaceful bearing in the middle of the imperial palace struck the emperor deeply. Again, we can't verify the exact encounter, but we can verify the result. Ashoka began studying Buddhism deeply. He began meeting with monks. He began spending time away from the court in meditation and reflection. He stopped hunting, those grand royal hunts that were a symbol of imperial power. He became, by his own account, a Buddhist lay follower. According to Buddhist tradition, Ashoka eventually undertook a pilgrimage, a sacred journey, to the important sites of the Buddha's life. He visited Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha had attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. He visited Lumbini, in what is today Nepal, the birthplace of the Buddha. He visited Sarnath, near Varanasi, where the Buddha gave his first sermon. At Lumbini, Ashoka left a pillar, one of his famous stone pillars, with an inscription that still exists today. It reads, King Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, when he had been consecrated 20 years, came himself and worshipped here because the Buddha Shakyamuni was born here. This inscription is one of our most valuable pieces of historical evidence. It confirms, in Ashoka's own words, that he personally visited Lumbini and that he identified the site as the birthplace of the historical Buddha. The Lumbini pillar inscription was one of the key pieces of evidence used by archaeologists to confirm the historical reality of the Buddha as a real person who actually lived, not just a legendary figure. The pillar proves that by Ashoka's time, 3rd century BCE, there was already a well-established tradition identifying Lumbini as the Buddha's birthplace. This is considered significant corroboration by historians studying the origins of Buddhism. Now, here's a question historians have wrestled with for generations, and it's worth raising with you honestly. Was Ashoka's transformation genuine, or was it a performance? Did he really change his heart, or was he a clever politician who saw that ruling through violence was getting too expensive and difficult, and decided that a new public image of peace and wisdom might be more useful? The honest answer is, we can't know for certain. The historical record doesn't give us a window into his private motivations. But here is what we can say. The changes he made were real. The policies he enacted, the inscriptions he left, the institutions he built, we'll cover all of these in the next chapters, were substantive, costly, and lasting. They required genuine commitment, and some of them, like publicly carving his own remorse into stone for the world to read, actually cost him political prestige rather than gaining it. Most historians, including Romila Thapar, conclude that Ashoka's transformation, while certainly influenced by political considerations, reflected something genuine. Interestingly, at almost the same moment Ashoka was converting to Buddhist ethics in India, the Stoic philosophers of Greece were developing their own system of rational ethics, the idea that wisdom and virtue, not wealth and power, are what make a good life. Across the ancient world, thinkers and rulers were independently asking the same question. How should we live? How should we treat each other? Ashoka was about to try to answer that question, not just for himself, for an entire empire. Chapter 8, Governing with Kindness. Imagine you are the most powerful ruler on earth. You control 5 million square kilometers. 50 million people answer to your laws. You have the largest army anyone has ever assembled. You could do literally anything. What would you use that power for? Ashoka had an answer. He would use it to try to make the world a little kinder. Beginning in the years after Kalinga, around 258 to 255 BCE, Ashoka launched one of the most extraordinary public communication campaigns in the ancient world. He had his thoughts, his values, his policies, and his regrets carved into stone, onto boulders beside roads, onto smooth stone pillars he had erected across the empire, in multiple languages, Prakrit, the common language of ordinary people, Greek, for the populations in the northwest who had Greek cultural heritage from Alexander's conquests, and Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Persian world. Think of it as the world's first government public announcement, except instead of a tweet or a billboard that disappears in days, Ashoka carved his messages into stone that would last millennia. These inscriptions are called the Edicts of Ashoka, and they are among the most precious historical documents from the ancient world. So what did they say? Let's look at the actual content of Ashoka's Dhamma, his governing philosophy. First, a word on the term. Dhamma is the ancient Prakrit form of the Sanskrit word dharma. In Ashoka's usage, it didn't mean simply Buddhism. It was broader than that. It was a code of ethical conduct that he wanted everyone in his empire to follow, regardless of whether they were Buddhist, Hindu, Jain, or followed any other tradition. Think of it like a school values charter. You know how schools sometimes have their principles written up on the wall. Respect, kindness, honesty, hard work. Ashoka's Dhamma was something like that, but for an entire civilization. Some specific policies Ashoka enacted or described in his edicts. 1. He restricted animal slaughter. In Rock Edict 1s, Ashoka declares restrictions on the killing of animals for the royal kitchen. He writes, and this is a direct reference to his own household, that where hundreds of thousands of animals were previously killed each day for the royal kitchen, now almost none are. He expresses his intention to eventually stop killing animals for food entirely. though historians note this ideal may not have been fully achieved in practice across the empire. He banned the killing of certain species entirely. Various animals and birds are listed in different edicts as protected. This was extraordinary. No ruler in the ancient world had previously issued anything like it. 2. He built hospitals and welfare infrastructure. In his second rock edict, Ashoka describes a welfare policy that reads almost startlingly modern. Everywhere in the empire of the beloved of the gods, and likewise in the territories of his neighbors, medical facilities have been established for the benefit of both men and animals. Medicinal plants have been imported and grown. Wells have been dug and trees planted along the roads for the use of humans and animals. Read that again. Medical facilities for humans and animals, medicinal plants imported from other countries, shade trees and wells planted along roads for travelers. More than 2,200 years ago. 3. He reformed the justice system. In his fourth pillar edict, Ashoka describes appointing special officials, called Rajukas, whose job was to ensure fair treatment for people in the provinces. He extended a period of time between when a prisoner was sentenced to death and when the sentence was carried out, giving prisoners and their families time to prepare, to say goodbyes, to appeal. He also ordered that prisoners be given a chance to receive charitable donations from the public, and that women in the judicial system receive better treatment. 4. He promoted tolerance between religions. In Rock Edict 12, Ashoka writes with remarkable openness about religious tolerance. One should not honor only one's own religion and condemn other religions. Instead, one should honor other religions for this or that reason. In so doing, one helps one's own religion to grow and renders service to the religions of others too. For a powerful king to carve this into stone, to publicly instruct his officials to respect and not interfere with religious communities other than his own, was unprecedented in the ancient world. While Ashoka was inscribing religious tolerance into stone in India, the Stoic philosophers in Greece were arguing that all humans are fundamentally equal, regardless of birth, two civilizations independently developing the idea that power should serve people rather than the other way around. Ashoka's edicts were found in locations as far apart as Kandahar in Afghanistan and Brahmagiri in Karnataka, a distance of over 3,000 kilometers. The fact that Ashoka erected inscriptions across this vast distance in multiple languages shows not just the enormous reach of the Mauryan Empire, but also Ashoka's deep personal investment in communicating directly with his subjects, bypassing intermediaries and speaking to ordinary people in their own languages. Ashoka also changed something more personal about the relationship between an emperor and his people. He describes in his edicts creating a new system of royal accessibility. He instructed his officials that the people's business should always be reported to him, at any time, in any place, because, as he writes, "The welfare of the people is my concern." An emperor who said and tried to prove that his subjects' welfare came before his own comfort. Was he perfect? No. Did the reality of governing a massive empire sometimes contradict these ideals? Certainly. But the aspiration itself, the public, permanent inscription of these values into stone, changed what was expected of rulers. Forever. Chapter 9. Spreading the Message. Ashoka did not want to keep the message of Dhamma within the borders of his own empire. He wanted to share it with the world. And so he launched what historians believe was one of the first organized missionary campaigns in human history. Not to conquer, not to trade, but simply to share a way of living. According to Buddhist traditions, particularly the Sri Lankan chronicles Dipavamsa, Island Chronicle, and Mahavamsa, Great Chronicle, written in Pali, Ashoka convened a great third Buddhist council at Pataliputra around 250 BCE. This was a gathering of Buddhist monks and scholars to clarify the teachings of the Buddha and organize the spread of Buddhism to new territories. Historians note that while the Third Council is recorded primarily in Buddhist sources and its precise historical details are debated, there is strong evidence that Ashoka did actively support and fund the expansion of Buddhism beyond his borders. The most famous of Ashoka's missionary missions was the one sent to Sri Lanka, the island nation just south of India, across the Palk Strait. And here's what makes this story remarkable. The people he sent were his own children. Mahinda, Ashoka's son, led the mission to Sri Lanka. He was a Buddhist monk trained in the Dharma and by all accounts, a brilliant teacher. The Sri Lankan chronicles describe his arrival in great detail. He encountered the Sri Lankan king, Devanampiya Tissa, on a hunting expedition. Mahinda reportedly engaged the king in a subtle philosophical dialogue that demonstrated the depth of his wisdom, and the king was so impressed that he converted to Buddhism. What followed was extraordinary. The Sri Lankan king embraced Buddhism with great enthusiasm, and with Ashoka's material support, including gifts, relics, and resources, Buddhism took deep root in Sri Lanka. It has never left. Today, Sri Lanka is a predominantly Buddhist nation. The Buddhism practiced there, Theravada Buddhism, traces its lineage directly to this mission from Ashoka's court more than 2,250 years ago. This is one of the most significant cultural transfers in the history of religion. Sanghamitra, Ashoka's daughter, brought something extraordinary to Sri Lanka, a cutting from the original Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, the very tree under which the Buddha is said to have attained enlightenment. That cutting was planted at Anuradhapura, Sri Lanka's ancient capital. The tree that grew from it still stands today, over 2,250 years old, making it the oldest living human-planted tree in the world, with a verified historical record. You can visit it. People still bring flowers to it every day. But Ashoka's reach didn't stop at Sri Lanka. His edicts mention that he sent Dhamma missions to at least 5 kingdoms in the west, kingdoms he names as Antioga, Antiochus II of Syria, Turamaya, Ptolemy II of Egypt, Antikini, Antigonus of Macedonia, Makkah, Magas of Cyrene, and Alikyashudara, Alexander II of Epirus. Let that sink in. Ashoka was writing to the kings of Syria, Egypt, and Macedonia, the great Hellenistic rulers who controlled the post-Alexander world, proposing to share his ethical philosophy with them. We don't have records of how these Western kings responded, but the fact that Ashoka thought it worth trying and carved the record of his attempt in stone speaks to the extraordinary ambition of his vision. He also sent missions eastward, to Burma, to what is today Thailand, possibly to other parts of Southeast Asia. Buddhist traditions in Myanmar, Burma, and Thailand trace their origins to missionaries from Ashoka's era. The Buddhism of Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka today, practiced by hundreds of millions of people, is in significant part Ashoka's legacy. Not swords, not armies, not slaves or tribute or stolen gold. While Ashoka was sending missionaries of peace to the Mediterranean, the Chinese state of Qin was completing its conquest of rival kingdoms through sheer military force. 2 very different models of how to build a lasting civilization, one imposed by armies, one offered through ideas. History would judge both. Chapter 10, The Pillars That Still Stand. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are standing in a field in Bihar, northern India. The grass is long, the sky is enormous, and rising from the earth in front of you, still upright, still polished to a mirror sheen after more than 2,000 years, is a stone column. It was put here by Ashoka. It has stood here since approximately 250 BCE. These pillars, sometimes called the Ashokan columns, are among the most remarkable engineering and artistic achievements of the ancient world. They were monolithic, meaning each pillar was carved from a single piece of stone, usually a beautiful cream-colored sandstone quarried from Chunar in what is today Uttar Pradesh. They were then polished, using a technique that Mauryan craftsmen apparently perfected, to a mirror-like finish so precise that modern experts still aren't entirely sure how it was achieved with the tools of the time. The pillars range from about 12 to 15 meters tall. That's roughly 40 to 50 feet, or as tall as a 4-story building. And they were transported, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, to their installation sites. Some pillars were topped with magnificent animal capitals, sculptures in the round carved from the same stone, lions, bulls, elephants, wheels. And the most famous of all, the lion capital of Sarnath. Found at Sarnath, near Varanasi, the site of the Buddha's first sermon, this capital consists of 4 magnificent lions seated back to back atop a circular platform, below which is carved an ornate frieze of animals separated by dharma wheels, the whole resting on an inverted lotus. It is considered one of the masterpieces of ancient Indian art, and it is now the national emblem of India. When India became independent in 1947, its founders chose the Ashokan lion capital as the country's official symbol, a direct acknowledgement of Ashoka's place at the foundation of Indian civilization. That spinning blue wheel you see in the center of India's national flag, that's called the Ashoka Chakra, the Wheel of Ashoka. It has 24 spokes. It comes directly from the Dharma wheel depicted on the lion capital and other Ashokan monuments. Every time you look at India's flag, you are looking at a 2,250-year-old symbol, created by Ashoka's craftsmen, adopted by modern India to represent the principles of justice, progress, and righteousness. The Ashoka Chakra is on the flag of over 1 billion people. Beyond the pillars, Ashoka built and expanded hundreds of stupas, dome-shaped Buddhist monuments that typically contain relics related to the Buddha or to Buddhist saints. The Buddhist chronicles claim he built 84,000 stupas across the empire, a number that is certainly legendary and symbolic rather than literal, but which points to a genuine massive building campaign. The great stupa at Sanchi, which we mentioned earlier in connection with Devi, was expanded and beautified under Ashoka's direction and is today one of the best preserved ancient monuments in the world. Zoom out. While Ashoka was building pillars and stupas in India, the Romans were laying the Appian Way, and the Egyptians were completing the great lighthouse at Alexandria. The ancient world's great civilizations all shared one instinct: build things that last. What they built tells us who they were. Ashoka built monuments to ethics. What we build tells the world what we care about. Chapter 11, The Fading Emperor. Empires are not built to last forever, and even the greatest emperors grow old. The later years of Ashoka's reign, roughly the last decade or so before his death around 232 BCE, are historically murky. The sources, both Buddhist and secular, become thinner and more contradictory. What we can piece together is a picture of gradual fading, complicated by what may have been internal political tensions. The Mauryan Empire, still vast but with the edges beginning to show strain, distant provinces hard to control, the natural entropy of a huge administrative structure. One persistent story in the Buddhist sources, including the Ashoka Vadana, describes a tension in Ashoka's later years between his extreme generosity toward Buddhist monasteries and institutions and the concerns of his advisors and ministers about the drain on imperial resources. The story goes that Ashoka gave away so much of the royal treasury to Buddhist causes that his ministers eventually began intercepting his donations, placing a bureaucratic block on his giving. Whether this is historical fact or Buddhist legend meant to illustrate Ashoka's bottomless generosity is debated. What we know for certain is that after Ashoka's death around 232 BCE, the exact date is uncertain, the Mauryan Empire entered a period of rapid decline. Within 50 years it had shrunk significantly. Within 100 years, the dynasty itself was gone, the last Mauryan emperor assassinated by his own commander in 185 BCE. Why did the empire decline so quickly after Ashoka? Historians have proposed several factors. The enormous size of the empire made it inherently difficult to govern without strong, centralized control, and the successors to Ashoka were apparently less capable. The financial cost of maintaining the administration and army was enormous, and Ashoka's own policies, his restrictions on hunting and animal slaughter, his reduced enthusiasm for military expansion, that may have weakened the military culture and revenue streams that empires required. There is also the question of whether Ashoka's successors shared his values. The answer appears to be not particularly. The peace and Dhamma philosophy Ashoka championed was deeply personal. It didn't automatically transfer to the next generation. This is one of the great paradoxes of Ashoka's story. The man who may have done more for human welfare than any ruler of his age also, perhaps, contributed to the end of the political structure that gave him the power to do good. We don't know exactly how Ashoka died. We don't have a deathbed scene. We don't have final words. He simply, like the empire he built, fades from the historical record. Around 232 BCE, the emperor was gone. Zoom out. In China, the very same decade that Ashoka died, the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang, also died, and his dynasty collapsed almost immediately. Two of the ancient world's greatest empires, built at almost exactly the same time, ended at almost exactly the same time. Power is always temporary. What outlasts it? The question Ashoka spent the second half of his life trying to answer. Chapter 12. Why we still remember him. For about 1500 years after his death, the world forgot Ashoka. Not partially forgot, completely forgot. The empire that bore his family's name dissolved within 50 years of his death. The edicts he carved into stone sat in fields and on hillsides across India, their Brahmi script unreadable to anyone alive. The Buddhist traditions in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia remembered his name, but in India itself, where he had ruled, he was a ghost. Then came 1837, and James Prinsep, and the silent emperor spoke again. When Prinsep decoded the Brahmi script and realized these inscriptions were from an emperor who called himself beloved of the gods, and when scholars over the following decades confirmed that this emperor was Ashoka, the reaction was, by historical standards, extraordinary. Historians, philosophers, political thinkers, and ordinary people read Ashoka's own words and were astonished. Here was an ancient emperor who had publicly confessed to grief and remorse, who had inscribed kindness and tolerance into stone, who had sent missionaries of peace to distant lands, who had built hospitals for humans and animals. H.G. Wells, the famous British author and historian, wrote in his Outline of History, 1920, that among the thousands of rulers history has recorded, Ashoka shines, and shines almost alone, a star. Wells noted that Ashoka's name deserved to be placed beside those of Jesus and the Buddha in any list of the great ethical teachers of humanity. When India gained independence in 1947, the leaders of the new nation, Jawaharlal Nehru, B.R. Ambedkar, and others, looked to Ashoka consciously and deliberately as a model for what a modern Indian state should aspire to. They chose the Ashokan lion capital as the national emblem. They placed the Ashoka chakra on the national flag. They were saying, this is who we are, this is what we believe in, not the kings who conquered us, not the emperors who owned us. This man is our ancestor. But Ashoka's legacy reaches beyond India. The Theravada Buddhism of Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, practiced by roughly 150 million people today, traces its unbroken lineage to the missionaries Ashoka sent from his court. When you see a Buddhist monk in orange robes on the streets of Bangkok, or Colombo, or Yangon, you are seeing in part the living legacy of a decision Ashoka made 2,250 years ago. His edicts, preserved in stone, scattered across the Indian subcontinent, remain one of the most remarkable collections of primary historical documents from the ancient world. They allow us to hear an ancient ruler speak in his own voice about his own failures, his own hopes, his own beliefs. That is almost unparalleled. And the ideas he championed, nonviolence, religious tolerance, the welfare of ordinary people as the government's primary duty, the equal protection of all subjects under law, are ideas that feel less like ancient history and more like the principles we still argue about today. Was Ashoka perfect? No. He was capable of tremendous violence. Kalinga proved that. His empire was not democratic or egalitarian in any modern sense. Women in his society had limited formal power. The caste system, which caused immense suffering, continued under his reign. His successors undid many of his reforms. But he was the first ruler in recorded history to publicly declare that the welfare of his subjects, including animals, was his personal responsibility, that different religions deserved equal respect and protection, that a king should feel grief, not pride, when his actions caused suffering. These ideas had to start somewhere. Zoom out, one final time. We live in a world that still hasn't fully learned the lessons Ashoka tried to teach. Wars still happen. People still suffer from the choices of powerful leaders. But the ideals he inscribed in stone, the radical revolutionary notion that power exists to serve people, not the other way around, have survived 2 millennia of attempts to bury them. He carved them in rock. They're still there. We started this story on a battlefield. We end it here, on the same river that ran past the city where Ashoka was born, where he ruled, where he died. The Ganges, ancient, enormous, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, still flowing. I want to talk to you directly. You watching this, because the story of Ashoka isn't really about an ancient emperor in a long-gone empire. It's about a question that every single person, including you, has to answer eventually. Ashoka had more power than almost any human being who ever lived. 5 million square kilometers, 50 million people, the largest army on earth. And for a while, he used that power the way most powerful people do, to get more power, more territory, more control. And then he stood at the edge of the Daya River and looked at what he had done. And he asked himself, is this who I want to be? You are 9 or 10 or 11 years old. You don't command armies. You don't have an empire. But you have power, more than you realize. You have the power to be kind when it would be easier to be cruel. You have the power to speak up when something is wrong, even when it's uncomfortable. You have the power to listen to people who are different from you, different backgrounds, different beliefs, with real curiosity instead of suspicion. Ashoka tried, imperfectly, inconsistently, humanly, to use his power that way. He didn't always succeed. Nobody does. But he tried, and he wrote the attempt in stone. His pillars are still there. His words are still there. Here is what I find most remarkable about Ashoka, and the thought I want to leave you with. He had already won. He had conquered Kalinga. He had the largest empire on earth. And then he decided, deliberately, publicly, permanently, that winning wasn't enough, that the way you win matters, that who you are after the battle matters more than the battle itself. The lions of Ashoka have been staring out at the world for 2,250 years, 4 directions watchful, patient, waiting to see what we do with the ideas he left us.